In Matthew, the 5th chapter, in the 44th verse, there's a little item, just one little verse that's a part of the whole theme of the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus gave all his ideas about how we could live in a way that would make our lives most fulfilling. And in this particular passage, this little verse, there's a verse that goes something like, if somebody compels you to go a mile with him, go with him 2. Now for us, that's a pretty innocuous statement. But if we come out of that particular culture in which Jesus was talking, this is probably one of the most controversial statements that Jesus ever made. Because you see, in those days, when the Romans came over and took over a country, what they usually did was make the people, or maybe just the leaders, they would put up a Roman gate, and you had to bow your head and walk through the gate in order to show that you were going to be obedient to the Roman country, Roman nation. Sometimes they just did it with the leaders, and other times they did it with everybody in the community. And in this thing, when you did that, you were going to be obedient. One of the ideas of being obedient was that you would be willing to, if somebody asked you to, a Roman soldier asked you to go a mile, carry something for him for a mile, you'd be willing to do it. And so what happened was, this was one of the things that bothered the Jewish people as much as anything else, because it meant that they had to be subservient to the Romans. And so what they did, if he was a farmer, he would take and he would stake out his property in such a way that it was exactly a mile. And then he would expect that if somebody came at him, he would only carry it a mile and he'd not carry it any further. And Jesus comes along and says, hey, that's not the rule. The rule is if somebody asks you to do something at this level, you got to do more. What he was really saying is, you got to be willing to do more than can be reasonably or expected or required of you. That's the principle. There's a principle in life that if we want to get all that life wants to give us, we can only get it if we're willing to do more and be willing to give more than can be reasonably expected of us. And of course, this was one of the rules. One time, a surgeon was doing some surgery, and people from all over the country would come to watch him because he was renowned as a surgeon. And one day, when he finished his treatment or his surgery, everybody walked out but one young man. This one young man came to him and said, hey, I got something I need to talk to you about. I noticed that when you finished the surgery, you tied a knot, and then you tied a second knot, and in fact you tied 3 knots. And he said, I know that the medical books say that if you're going to, it's only necessary to tie 1 knot. How come you're tying 3 knots? And the surgeon says, well, tonight when I lay down on my pillow, I'm going to rehearse all of my surgeries, and I'm going to come to that place when I say to myself, will the thread hold? And then I'll think to myself, yeah, it'll hold because I didn't just tie 1 knot, I tied 2 knots, and I tied 3 knots. And the third knot is my sleeping knot. What he was saying was that if we're willing to do more than can be reasonably expected, because that was surely the case in this particular story, that you would find something of value. Because what it does, if we do more than can be reasonably expected, it leaves a deposit of happiness inside of us. And that was true for this doctor. He had happiness inside of him because he went the 2nd mile. He did more than could be reasonably or expected, required of him. And as a result of that, it gave him a deposit of happiness that enabled him to live life. We could tell this story in reference to the idea that we had about 2 farmers. One farmer had just had everything measured out so that when a soldier came along and said you had to carry it, he didn't have it measured out just the end of his property, but he had it measured out maybe every meter or every yard. He had a stake, and he knew where it was down the road, which was exactly a mile. And he'd go only that far, and then when he'd get there, he'd throw the bag down on the ground, and he'd say, you know, the day will come when we'll be on top, and then you will have to be subservient to us. And he'd rant and he'd rave, and he'd go back to his farm, and he'd pick up his hoe, and he began to hoe angrily, and lo and behold, he'd break maybe the whole handle. And then there was the other kind of boy. This guy had heard Jesus, who said, if you can do more than is reasonably can be required of you, you'll leave a deposit of happiness inside of you that will grace your life. And this man said, that's what I'm going to do. So whenever a soldier came his way, he just gladly stopped what he was doing. He didn't let the soldier holler at him a long time, but he went right over and he picked up his bag. And as they walked along, he had conversation with the soldier. He asked him what he was doing. He asked him how come he was in the army. He asked him all kinds of personal questions just to get to know him. And when he got to the place where the mile was, he just kept walking. He walked and he walked, and all of a sudden the soldier recognized that the man had walked further than he had to. And he stopped the man and said, "Hey, you stop. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to send you this far. And I want you to know that as a result of your behavior, I have a new respect for the Jewish people." What was that? That was leaving a deposit of happiness. Well, when the man got through, he went on back to his work, and he probably did twice as much work as he'd ever done before. And when he got ready to go home, he walked into the house, and his wife said to him, "Hey, I can tell something really beautiful happened to you. You must have gone the second mile. You must have done more than can be reasonably expected or required of you, because it's left this deposit of happiness in you that I can see." A powerful idea, isn't it? That we can leave a deposit of happiness. The story is told about over in Cremona, Italy, that there was three boys, Salvador, Julio, and Antonio. And these boys well, actually Salvador had a beautiful tenor voice, and Julio played the violin beautifully, and they would accompany each other. And though Antonio, he couldn't sing. His voice was squeaky and he was ugly, and he couldn't sing, and everybody made fun of him whenever he tried to sing. And Julio and Salvador would go to the center of the city, and they would begin to sing, and people would invariably give them something for having sung. And so they were doing that kind of thing. And so it turned out that on the festival day, they went to the cathedral, and they were singing in front of the cathedral. Lots of people came and gave them money, but Antonio just went along for the ride. They said, "Come on, you can go with us even if you can't sing," and they made fun of the fact he couldn't sing. They said, "All you are is a whittler," because he had a knife and he could whittle out objects. And so he went along with Julio and Salvador, and they got there and they were singing. Everybody brought something, and finally one man who was very distinguished walked out of the crowd. He walked up to Julio and he handed him a coin. And when Julio looked into his hand, his eyes opened real wide because it was a gold coin. And he took it and he bit it with his mouth to see if it was real. And then the three boys excitedly looked at it because it was a gold coin. And Julio said, "You know who that was that gave us that coin? It was Amati." "Who's Amati?" Antonio said. And they laughed. They said, "Well, you don't know anything about music, so you wouldn't know who Amati is. He's the greatest violin maker in the world, and he lives in our city. And he came and he heard us, and he left us some money." Well, Antonio went home that night, and he was sorry and sad about he couldn't sing, he couldn't do anything. But he said, "You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to find where Amati lives." And so the next day he got up early. He took a lot of the objects that he'd whittled, and he put them in his pockets, and he walked out into the city. And he searched until he found Amati's house. And he went to the door and he knocked on it. And in his squeaky voice he asked if he could see the master. Well, it just turned out that Amati was still home, and he heard the squeaky voice, and so he came to see who was the voice that was talking. And when Antonio saw Amati, he said, "Can you see these things? These are things that I've made. I can't sing, but I love music, and I like to do something with music. Is it possible that I could be a violin maker?" And Amati said, "If you got the heart for music, if it's in your heart, if your heart sings, then it's okay. There'll be a way that you can express your music. It might be an art. It can be all kinds of ways, but you can express your music." And so Antonio started going over to Amati's violin shop. And while he was there, he kept asking Amati if he could be one of his apprentices. And eventually, Amity said, yes, you can. And he put Antonio to work. And Antonio watched him and did everything he did for several years. And when he was 22 years old, Antonio was 22 years old, he knew about everything that a violin needed, a maker needed to know. He knew every one of the 70 different pieces that make up a violin. And at that time, Amity said to him, you can make your own violin. And he made his first violin. And then when he signed it, he signed it Antonio Stradivarius. And in his lifetime, he made 1,100 violins. And they're violins that everybody values very greatly. And it all happened because he was willing to make the trip to find Amity. He was willing to go with his friends even though they made fun of him. He went the second mile. He did more than could be reasonably or expected or required of him. And he was graced by God's grace. It's a truth that we need to get into our hearts this morning, that if we're willing to do more than can be reasonably expected and required of us, there will be a deposit of happiness left inside of us. I'm asking today that God will do that for us. Let's pray. Lord, make me an instrument of your peace, that I might be able to be someone who gives more than can be reasonably required. Thank you in your name. Amen.